Thank you all for coming. I think we've heard a number of times it's not just enough to know a few things about this. You gotta stand up and lead. Tell your story. Reach out to media. Those darn talking head. Oh yeah, I'm a talking head too. But still, reach out to media. Let your story be told. This panel is going to focus on affordable housing and rent control. And we have two panelists this time around. First of all, we have from the VP for Litigation for Pacific Legal Foundation, Sacramento, Mr. James Burling. Let's hear it for James. He has argued appellate property rights cases across the U.S., including at the Supreme Court. Also, joining on this panel today, the President and CEO of the California Building Industry Association. Please welcome Dan Dunmoyer. He is committed through education, advocacy, and communication efforts to ensure that CBIA continues to be the leading voice of housing in California. He's been involved in the public and private sector for over 30 years. Which one of you gentlemen would like to lead off?
Okay.
Jeb, go ahead. It's all yours.
So I was reading one of my favorite books that I like to read the other night. It was a book about 30 years ago called Rent Control, Myths and Realities. Actually, I only read it for the pictures. Because this book, published about 30 years ago, had a series of about a dozen photographs in it. It was a photograph of inner cities, these torn out places that were just a mess, burned out buildings, abandoned properties. And the caption on each one of these dozen or so photographs says, burned out building in such and such a place, victim of bombing in the war or rent control. And you could not tell from looking at these photographs. You'd have to go to the back to see the answer. Was this property a victim of rent control or a bombing during a war? Well, like war, rent control has been around a while of various kinds and sorts, but fortunately it's only a temporary measure because a 1921 case talked about rent control being adopted in Washington, D.C. and to some degree New York, but primarily Washington because of all the bureaucrats that had come in and all the war personnel that had come into Washington, D.C., creating a housing shortage. So rent control is adopted in Washington, D.C. for a 2-year period, and the Supreme Court said, you know, if we have an emergency, we can have rent control. Well, we've had an emergency every year now since World War I. It's routinely redeclared an emergency. But of course, we don't need an emergency for rent control anymore because it's such a good idea. Any economist that you talk to will tell you what a great idea rent control is. If you like to have a decrease in the amount of housing available. There are several aspects to rent control. One is vacancy decontrol. If you have a tenant, can you remove that tenant easily? Do you have to go through a just cause hearing? Is this going to be a hassle that you don't want to go through? Does the tenant have to do something absolutely horrible? And not paying rent's not necessarily a horrible thing, but does the tenant have to threaten you in some way for you to have a just cause eviction? Well, it becomes extremely difficult. And of course, this puts landlords in a bind sometimes that if you have a tenant who bothers your other tenants, who is constantly the source of police visitations because police enjoy speaking to this individual so much, your property becomes a nuisance property and you're caught between a rock and a hard place. If you don't get rid of the tenant, the police are going to be after you and try to take your property for that reason. But of course, if you do try to get rid of the tenant and there's vacancy decontrol, you have problems there. And the other aspect of rent control, of course, is the ability to keep rents low. Now, it doesn't seem like such a bad idea, but anybody who owns a single home or a private home knows what homes are. They are money pits for unexpected expenses, right? I just put in a new air conditioning system the other day. Now, if you have to do that on rental property, you want to be able to recoup your investment. If you want to make it into a nicer place, you want to be able to recoup that. But in some communities in California that have rent control, good luck going before the rent control board. Oh, they'll allow you to have increases that keep track of the consumer price index, well, maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of that year in and year out. But as far as getting the rent board to understand what it actually takes to maintain property or even improve it and get your finances from that, well, good luck. So Pacific Legal Foundation's been involved in challenging rent control for a long time. And I'm just going to tell you one story about a case where we got this close to overturning rent control in California. It's a case where we looked at the Supreme Court had said that, look, if you can show that a law, a regulation fails to substantially advance a legitimate governmental interest, that could be grounds for overturning it as a violation of either the takings clause or due process clause. So we commissioned a study from an economist who looked at a series of rent control jurisdictions throughout California, compared a rent control jurisdiction with a neighboring non-rent control jurisdiction. And we looked at the demographics of the tenants in the non-rent control jurisdiction versus a rent control jurisdiction. And then we looked at the justifications given for the rent control ordinances. And without exception, every rent control ordinance was supposed to help the poor, the elderly, the disabled, those people that are socially and economically dispossessed, minority populations, people that have trouble making it in the American dream. These are the people that rent control is supposed to help. But in every single instance of our comparisons, we found that the people that lived in rent-controlled markets were generally richer, better educated, whiter, healthier than the people living in rent-controlled or the non-rent controlled jurisdictions. And that is because people who have those attributes of success, people that have it made in the country, are more likely to have the stability in their lives to stay in a rent-controlled unit. And economists will tell you, rent control doesn't help anybody, with one exception, and I'll get to that in a second. Rent control simply is not a workable solution to our housing crisis. It causes landlords or it causes builders not to want to build rental housing. New York City just passed, or New York State just passed a very sweeping rent control measure, basically wiping out all the reforms that they used to have as far as getting properties out of rent control. And the Wall Street Journal reported today that rent-stabilized apartment buildings are now dropping 20 to 45% in value overnight because of the rent control laws in California. So who does rent control help? It helps the politicians who use rent control as a vehicle for getting in office and staying there. Rent control is the way that we've had some politicians like Tom Hayden get a start in Santa Monica. Rent control is a way that some politicians will pander to people, realizing full well they've got to know that rent control doesn't work. Nevertheless, they will try to pass rent control. So we went to court with the argument that rent control does not substantially advance a legitimate governmental interest, and a court of appeal actually agreed, a case called Santa Monica Beach, and tossed out rent control in Santa Monica. Then the case went up to the California Supreme Court. California Supreme Court, in their ultimate wisdom, because of course they're wiser than you, me, and every economist that ever looked at the issue, they said, of course, just because rent control does not meet those stated purposes of the rent control ordinances, we know that rent control does substantially advance one legitimate governmental interest, and that is the interest of keeping rents low. Astonishing. And so rent control for a 4-3 vote was upheld in California. We are trying to get rent control, other opportunities to get at it. We just had an unrelated Supreme Court victory on Friday that said we can now go into federal court to challenge regulations that take away property rights. And we hope to be using that door. Thank you. You know you had a good decision when Kagan gets really sarcastic and nasty. So we had a great decision in that, and we hope to be able to use that to walk into the federal courthouse doors on some rent control measures in the future. Back to you. Or over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Let's give Jim another round of applause for those great comments. So Dan Dunmore with the California Building Industry Association. I just want to bring you up to speed on the current housing crisis in California and give you some insights that I hope you'll find both illuminating, slightly depressing, but some encouraging comments I hope to conclude with. First and foremost, I'm a native Californian. I was born in the beautiful city of Hollywood, and my father wanted to move from Hollywood to the small town of Hemet because it was so expensive to build in Hollywood. He was building homes in Hollywood for $15,000 a year, and he had no idea how anybody could afford to purchase a $15,000 home. That home, as Rex was giving his story, the home I grew up in Hollywood, which my dad sold for $17,000, sold for $1.7 million last year. So it gives you a sense of real estate prices. Moved to Hemet to build the first affordable housing units there. They're called apartments, and didn't have any of those in Hemet. And learned from a young age about what it's like to try to build property and build homes in California. Let's fast forward to today. I have now just two teenagers and a daughter who's 25. My daughter sat down with me, very smart woman, very capable, and she said, "Dad, I'd love to buy a house." And I said, "That's a great idea, Heather. You should do that." She says, I don't know how many people do this, but she's saving $20,000 a year as a 23-year-old. When I was 23, I was saving $20 a month if I was lucky. She sat down and figured out the calculation to buy a fixer-up in Oakland at the current rate of savings. She'll be able to buy a home when she's 39. She'll need to put a deposit down of $400,000 to purchase a fixer-upper, and that's assuming housing prices only go up 3%. And that's why I'm here today, and that's why this housing crisis is real. There is no future for housing for our children if we do not address the situation we live in. Now, one of the questions we're often asked at CBIA is, well, why does it cost so much to build houses? Must be because you guys make so much money. That's why it costs so much. So there's this novel concept. It's not hard to figure out. It's called Nevada, Oregon, Arizona, Utah. For some reason, people in those states have figured out how to build homes that are more affordable. And the primary reason why we cannot build affordably in California is the issue of delay and fees. It's really this simple. The policy issues here are not complicated. So delays. If you look at a piece of property in Nevada, I just cross over and go to Reno. You'll see where we're building a lot of homes over there. You look at a piece of land, you ask the question, what will the economy be like in Nevada in 20 months? And as a home builder and a developer, that's what you look at. When you look at a piece of land here in California, you have to ask the question of what will the economy be like in 20 years? So a large project in California is not uncommon for projects to take 20 to 25 years to build. Now, you don't have to all be as smart as Kelly is to understand from an investment perspective. If I tell you I can double your money in 1 year, you're interested. If I can tell you I can double your money in 25 years, you kind of walk away. And that's the challenge for us as home builders, is it's very complicated to build. The other question on why we can't build homes that are affordable are the issue of fees. So one of the big excuses that's come out of Prop 13 is a statement that, well, we as cities need to charge development fees. We need to charge you the right to build. And those fees, when my dad first started, were out enormous. They were $500 to $700 per home. Today, a cheap fee would be $50,000 per home. If you're in Livermore or Richmond, it's $157,000 to $200 in fees per home. Now, that doesn't take into account the engineering costs, the experts, the biologists, all the other people that come into bear. But it's really hard to build a home in California that most people can afford if the fees are that high. And the challenge also for us is that's just the fee side. The delay side includes bringing in biologists, bringing in experts. If you don't go very far from here, a little town called Lathrop, you're on the way to Stockton. There's this River Island. You'll see this little development. In order to build there, they had to create a bunny habitat. You think I'm making this stuff up. So they didn't have enough bunnies. It's a very unique bunny. The problem is you think bunnies would have no problems creating their own habitats from everything I learned in biology. But for whatever reason, they had to spend $2.3 million to create a safer bunny habitat. Well, what does that mean? It adds $15,000 per home. And then you add in additional other fees, additional requirements. And all of a sudden, you're finding yourself as a home builder taking into account all of these costs. What we're doing as a society in an effort to pay for our pensions, pay for our other government programs, we're sinking all the costs of running a society into the new home. That does two things. It pushes the price of the home through the roof, but it also pushes the cost up of all the existing housing stock. So that, in other words, you see the price move up, supply goes down, costs go up. So as novel as this is, we build the exact same homes we build in California in the neighboring states and in Florida and other states at approximately 60% less. The exact same architectural design, the exact same structure. The only thing different in the other states, besides paying $240,000 to $280,000 a home versus $780,000 to $900,000 a home, is you actually get more land in the other states. That's the only difference of the home that we build and we sell. So there are things that government can do. And so on the positive note, the good news is we have an interest in housing like we've never had in the California legislature and the governor's office. So we're very excited about the fact. The question now is, will people like yourself in this room rise up and say, hey, we have a housing crisis. What are you going to do about it? As novel as it sounds, one of the first things you need to tell the elected officials, and what I tell every day, it's called the Hippocratic Oath of Housing. Now, you don't know about that. Hippocratic Oath for medical is do no harm. Well, in the legislature, many times the solution costs money. And we're looking for solutions that cost less. So ask the politician, hey, don't vote for bills that add to the cost of housing. We're paying enough. The second thing is to look for ways to make it easier and faster to build homes. And that's going to also keep the cost down. So we have a governor who's committed to building 3.5 million homes in the next 8 years. We have never done that once. That's about 425,000 homes. Our record's 1963, 331,000 homes. So he wants to build basically 50% more than we've ever built in 1 year. And he wants to do it 8 years in a row. This year we're on track to 100,000. So we're down 325,000 from his goal. But God bless the governor for at least saying he wants to build a home. Because most local government politicians run on no more growth. And that's really our challenge. I believe local government should control their local communities, but the challenge is most people say, you can build. We need more homes, just not here. It's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. What we need now are YIMBYs. Yes, in my backyard. Build it wise, build it smart, build it more affordably. We also have a lieutenant governor, Eleni Kounalakis, who is also has a representation. She's a former builder herself. So we have a governor, lieutenant governor who get it. I mean, to Gavin Newsom's credit, he has built 22 projects in California. He has been threatened by labor. He can empathize. Our legislature struggles a little bit more. We have a few legislators who really get it, but they haven't brought any bills to the governor that he can sign yet. So part of what we need you to do is just reach out to your local elected, Democrat, Republican. Last time I checked, Democrats and Republicans both need homes. And our goal is to get more people to, like yourselves, to ask the question of local electeds. I don't care what your party stripe is. What actions are you taking to making it easier and faster to build homes? I'll conclude with this last insight about our challenge. And just to touch on what my colleague here has said, if you look at issues like rent control and more requirements, we do have this desire to have the greenest state in the planet. And that's a great noble goal. I applaud that. But we've taken it now to an absurd extreme. We've decided that we're more willing to add more regulations to the point where people can't afford to have a home. And that to me is not finding the sweet spot of environmental protection. That's just taking an excess to the point where your actions and your ideology result in absurd outcomes. You need to ask the question, maybe this isn't the right path to take. So I just urge you in that process to continue to ask and hold your politicians, your local elected officials, your statewide officials, and your state officials accountable in this effort. And we think together we can be part of a solution. Together we can find ways to lower the cost of building homes. And so my children, your children, or young people here, they have the opportunity to have a piece of the American dream, grow their net worth, and become a really productive and successful citizen. Thank you.